Hi there, David here, and in this video, we'll be talking about contracts. So recently I was approached by an established company who wanted to hire me as a subcontractor for their studio. They basically wanted to hire me to be able to create and design sound effects for them and to be able to send it to them so that they could use in their game. Now, this was a new experience for me. Most of the time, I've been working with solo game developers or some really small game developers, and usually we would do so in agreement by word of mouth or through something like Fiverr.com, the platform, where Fiverr would basically hold on to their money that was already put up before the work got started. So we were both kind of protected in that way. So this was a new experience for me, and basically the company wanted to have a contract in place because they were a larger, more established company. They wanted to protect themselves and their assets, and of course also protect me as well. So they had a contract that they wanted to put in place for us to be able to work together. And what I'd like to share with you in this video is my experience with that. And what I'd like to do is kind of share with you kind of some things to look for, some things that perhaps you want to avoid, so that in the future, if you ever have to be in a position where you need a contract, that you can be confident going forward to protect yourself and the company that you're going to be working with. All right, before we start talking about contracts, if you are a video game sound designer, I have a gift for you. It is my sound designer starter pack. It's a sound pack of basically 900 plus sound effects. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there, like whooshes, monster sounds, spell sounds, a whole bunch of different sound effects in there that you can get and you can use in your commercial or personal projects. So you can get it absolutely free. I'll put a link in the description below. All right, before we get into the details of talking about contracts, I just want to say one thing. First of all, I am not a lawyer. I am not a contract expert. I just want to share my experience with you and things that I learned along the way and things that perhaps you want to look out for. So this is by no means any kind of professional advice. So please do see a lawyer if you are ever in a situation where you need to do or have a contract signed. All right, so for contracts, there's generally two types of contracts. The first one we'll label or call an all-in-one contract. And then the second one, you have your kind of your general contract that you sign ahead of time. And then you might have individual or single contracts after that follow after that. So what that might look like is for the general contract, you'll have a whole bunch of like general clauses and articles that you'll want to go through to set in place before you do individual contracts. So these are just generalized information, such as what kind of liability would you be in for if you were ever liable for any kind of damages. Things in the general contract might also include like when and how you're going to get paid. It might also include things like what happens if there's a breach of contract, intellectual property, who owns the intellectual property. It should also include details about deliverables. For example, like when would the deliverables be submitted or how they might be submitted. In terms of like payment, it might be like how you're going to get paid or when you're going to get paid and things like that. They're kind of general things. They're not going to be specific. But once you have this general contract in place, then what would happen is then you could have individual contracts. And these can just be in the form of like an email. Those could be, if I'm not mistaken, something like legally they can be considered individual contracts once this general contract is signed. So once that is done, your individual contract then would go into specific details. So the company might contact you and be like, and ask for a specific number of sound effects, like, hey, we need 10 gun sound effects that we need you to make by this specific date, and we're going to pay you this specific amount. So once you have the individual contract, that's when you go into absolute specifics. So the general contract is just a general things that are in place to protect you and the company should anything go bad. And then once you have the specific contracts, that's when you go into specific details about what you're going to do. So in general, whenever you have something like this, like general contract and then specific contracts afterwards that follow afterwards. Usually these are set up for like larger companies and companies that are just more established and have like just more assets and things under them. And yeah, so that's normally for that because it's a bit more work. It's a bit more tedious to go through all of that. But when you're working with smaller developers, what's common is that you'll have just like an all-in-one contract. So all in one like contract or in one document, you might have everything, including specifics of what might be included for your work. So it could be everything from your scope of your work, like, how many sound effects you're going to create, how much you're going to get paid, timelines, deadlines, things like that. So everything would be included in this all-in-one contract. So there would no be like general contract and like individual contracts. It'd just be like one thing. So let's say you're going to work on a video game and they're asking you to create all the sound effects for the game. Maybe you quote them, let's say $5,000 for the game. And then you would go into like specific details in the contract about what sounds those are going to be, how much you're going to get paid, when you're going to get paid, how you're going to get paid. It might also go into details about like revisions. What happens when revisions are required? What happens if you don't deliver on time? What happens if they don't pay you on time? Like everything would be in that one contract. There would be no other like separate contracts. So usually those, when you have an all-in-one contract, I'm quoting it as all-in-one. That's usually for small game developers or just solo developers that you might have that in place. All right. So with that said, we've mentioned and talked about like what different kinds of contracts are that are available and that you might see. Let's talk about what you might want to look for in a contract, and some of these are going to be super, super important. And so let's talk about this first one, which is going to be liability. So let's say that you are hired to do work, you sign a contract, and they say in the contract, well, if you don't deliver on time, you are liable for paying out all of the potential income loss that the company might have had if you had delivered on time. So if you don't limit that liability, you don't put a limit to that, that could be any amount of money. I mean, technically, I'm sure there's some like legal limits here, but like the company could turn around and sue you, let's say, for almost indefinite amounts of money. What if they say that in that one day or that 1 week that you didn't deliver your sounds, they couldn't finish their game, they couldn't deliver it on time, and therefore it cost them $1 million in potential revenue loss. Well, who's going to be liable for that? You would be liable for that. So it is super, super, super important to always have some sort of limits to your liability. So a common practice for limiting your liability is that you would not be liable for any more than the value of the contract. So if you're signing a contract to create all the sound effects for a video game, perhaps you're going to get paid $5,000 for the whole project. Well, then you should not be liable for any more than $5,000 worth of damages. That's a common practice. Sometimes it'll be more, like it could be anywhere from 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 times more. But generally, just like a one time, the value of that contract, you should not be liable for more than that, because that's kind of the work that you're putting into it. So it doesn't make sense that you'd be liable for more than that. That's a good baseline to have for your limiting your liability. Another reason or way that you might be liable for things is if you break the contract for any reason, whether it is that you can't complete the work or whatever it is, like perhaps you got sick and you just can't complete the work, or something happened, or whatever, perhaps you broke the contract by accident, or whatever it is. If you breach the contract, that could be another thing that you could be liable for damages for that. So make sure you limit it for that. And also, there could be exceptions where limiting liability is not possible or wouldn't happen, and usually that is around confidentiality. So if, for example, you break the confidentiality of the contract, whether that's personal information, proprietary information, copyright information, anything like that, or just NDA, if you sign an NDA and you breach that NDA, that you could be liable for a lot of damages for that, and it might not be suitable to have a limit on that. So I'm not sure what the industry standard would be for that. I don't know if there is an industry standard. I think it could be left open, because you could cause a lot of damages for that. So I think generally those are left open in terms of limiting liability. So just be aware of that. All right. The next thing to look for, next thing to have in your contract is your payments. So for payment, it's just basically how you're going to get compensated for your work. So not only are you going to want to include like how you're going to get paid, but also important to know when you're going to get paid. Are you going to get paid a portion ahead of time, like before the work starts? Is it going to be all after you're done? Is it going to be a split? Is there going to be a certain amount of time that you're going to have to wait before you get paid? Like perhaps you deliver everything and it's only going to be like 2-3 months after that. So make sure you check that out. Another thing is, well, let's say you're delivering all your work. Well, that's nice, but what if there's revisions on that work, right? What if they need to review and you need to revise some of your work? Are you going to get paid for that? Do you have to wait for all of the deliverables to be approved before you get paid? So these are all things that you want to look into and to have in your contracts set up and detailed before you start working. Another thing to include in terms of payment is just like how you're going to get paid. So is it going to be like, for example, a bank transfer? Is it going to be through like something like PayPal, or just like an e-transfer? So an online transfer, is it going to be cash, check, whatever it is? So you can always, you probably want to include that inside of the contract. All right, the next thing to include is intellectual property. So usually, or generally, I should say, for intellectual property for audio, whatever you create and you submit to the company for the game, usually that belongs to the company. As soon as you transfer it over, that belongs to them, and that's it. Like you don't own any of that, and that's quite normal. I think that's industry standard for that. There is a little point though that you might want to, or think about, or maybe you want to include into the contract, and that is that even though you're giving them all of this content and they own all of it, sometimes you can include something like it's theirs, but it can only be used on that one game. So they can't just use whatever you're sending them and then start using it on every other game that they're going to create in the future, right? So they're kind of limited in that way to have it used in that game and the promotional products and promotional material for that game, but that's it. So that is something you could include in there, but generally, yeah, the company will own all of the copyright for for the material. If you wanted to, one of the things you could also include or detail out is like, what about source materials and recorded files? Who would have the rights to that? Usually you would retain the rights to that, but it doesn't hurt to have it spelled out or detailed out to know exactly what it is. And just to know that you can use those source materials or those recorded audio files in the future as well. So if you go and like record sounds around your house and then you use those sounds to design sound effects for the game, can you still use those source files in other projects and other games for other companies, or are you limited to only that company? So that might be something that you want to include or check out in the contract. All right, finally, the last thing to check in the contract is exactly what services you're going to be providing for the company. So if it's just sound design services and you're just going to be creating sound effects and sending over audio files, that's great. Make sure that's really clear. But, sometimes you'll also be doing implementation. So you want to go into the scope of like what that's going to look like, how much implementation you're going to do. Are you going to be doing testing and debugging of that implementation, right? So it's good to like to lay that out and say what that is and how that's going to affect payment and deadlines and other things like that. And yeah, any other services that you're going to provide for them, you want to make sure that it's clearly described and labeled so that they know exactly what to expect, and you know also exactly what to expect to be delivering to them. All right, so these are all points that I would look for when I'm writing up a contract or looking into a contract that a company is sending over to me. There's a few other things that I do want to share with you though in terms of like my experience, and one of those things is that you should always be willing and open to negotiating the contract. So you should always be willing to walk away from a contract if you're not comfortable with any of the points or positions in the contract. So if anything that you're not comfortable with, you can always negotiate with the company, like let them know, especially if you want to work with them and they want to work with you, just let them know. It's like, it doesn't hurt to like negotiate and talk to them about it. What might be things that you're not comfortable with, and see if they'd be willing to kind of meet in the middle or change them completely so that you guys can work together. And that is a completely normal thing to do, is to negotiate with the people, the terms of the contract. And don't be afraid or worried if this takes a long time. It can take a long time to finalize a contract. It can take days, weeks, even to be able to finalize a contract. So it's not something that you will normally just have and then sign and then you're done. Usually you'll be looking it over and then sending over revisions or amendments to the contract and changing little clauses and things like that in the contract. That's completely normal. So don't be afraid to do that, and be willing and open to negotiate with them. And also, as you do that, you'll also be seeing from their side, from the company side, if they're open to negotiating as well. So it kind of shows you their interest in working with you if they are open to do that. And generally, like if people want to work with you and you want to work with them, like they'll negotiate with you, they'll talk with you, they'll go back and forth with the terms of the contract so that they can be agreeable to both of you and be good for both of you so that you can move forward with the work. So it's a completely normal thing, and just be aware of that. All right, so that's it for now. I hope you found this useful and valuable. Like I said, I'm no lawyer, expert, or anything. So if I missed anything, I'd be interested to learn from you if you've had any experience with contracts, whether it's like these general contracts leading into smaller individual contracts, or just all in one bundle, contracts where you lay out everything in one contract, you sign everything, and then you go. I'd love to learn anybody's experience and see if I missed anything. Maybe there's other things that you should look into when you're designing or reviewing your contracts. All right, if you want to see other videos that I've made about freelancing, I made one called What It's Like Working with Game Developers as a Freelancer, as a sound design freelancer. So if you want to see that, I'll put it above in the cards. Make sure to check it out. And just a reminder to grab that sound pack, that Sound Designer's Starter Pack, absolutely free, over 900 sounds if you're a sound designer. So check it out in the description. That's it for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.